Hi, I'm Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek, and this is Musical Monday. Today I'm just going to tell you a quick story that my violin instructor told me about 20 years ago. His name is Aldi Marquis. He's from Tulsa, and he was the principal violinist with the Tulsa Philharmonic. Now, if you don't know what a principal violinist is, in metropolitan symphonies, you have two violin sections to play two different violin parts in the different symphonies and concertos. And the head of the first violin section is called the concertmaster, and the head of the second violin section is called the principal violinist, and that's what Aldi was. Now, at the time that he was teaching me this, he had been the principal violinist for nearly 20 years. But there's a background to his story that I want to share with you. There's a moral to this story. Uh, Aldi was always good. He started on the violin when he was about 10, and he just took to it naturally. And when he was in high school, he was always first chair. He was always the best in his high school. And by the time he graduated from high school, he was already playing professionally. He was playing for weddings and doing chamber music gigs and stuff like that. And he had a scholarship to play violin for the University of Tulsa when he started college. But in the summer after he graduated from high school, as a graduation gift, his parents bought him 7 weeks of lessons with Ivan Galamian in upstate New York. Now, if you've never heard of Galamian, he was a legendary violin instructor. He was from Russia, born in Iran, but he grew up in Russia, and then he emigrated to the West and eventually set up shop in rural upstate New York. Can't remember the name of the city offhand, but he had a lot of famous violinists come and study with him at his school there. Now, he didn't take students that were beginner or intermediate. You had to be an aspiring violinist to study with Galamian. Pinchas Zuckerman, Joshua Bell, Itzhak Perelman. You might know some of those names. They were famous violinists. Also, he had other instructors there for other instruments like the cello. Yo-Yo Ma, famous cellist Yo-Yo Ma, studied there at his school as well. So Galamian was legendary. So Aldi was really excited that he was going to get to go up to New York for 7 weeks and study with the famous Galamian. But he didn't know anything about Galamian's style. So he gets there and he goes in for his first lesson. And you have to understand, Galamian, he's about 70 years old at this point. Aldi is 18. And Galamian was just a no-nonsense guy. He never smiled. He had no sense of humor. He was all business all the time. So Aldi goes in there, and Galamian says, "You play scales?" He says, "Yeah, I've played scales for years." And he points to one of the scales that he has prepared in in his little book that he put together, part of the curriculum, I guess you would say, for all of his students. He points to the scale and he says, "Play this scale." So Aldi gets his violin out. He starts playing through the scale, and Galamian taps on the tabletop a couple of times and says, "Stop." And Aldi thought, why did he tell me to stop? Well, above all of these scales and exercises, Galamian had written instructions for how you were supposed to do it. And he says, "Follow instructions." So Aldi reads through the instructions, and it was something like, first two notes upstroke, third note downstroke, one note upstroke, two notes downstroke. I mean, he was telling him specifically how he wanted the bowing pattern to be done. So he did it again, and of course it was a different kind of a bowing pattern. So it was, something that Aldi needed to practice a little bit. So he goes on to the next scale. He says, "Play this scale." So Aldi starts on that scale. Galamian goes, "Stop." Aldi says, "Now what?" The whole lesson went that way. He had him play through 10 scales, and every one of those scales, Aldi was doing it wrong. And Galamian had to explain to him how he wanted those scales played. So at the end of the lesson, he says, you practice scales and come back Friday or whatever the next lesson was. So Aldi leaves the lesson thinking, this is a waste of time. I know how to play scales. I've been playing scales for 8 years. You know, I was first chair in my high school orchestra. I've played professionally. Why am I up here studying scales? This is ridiculous. So anyway, he had a place that he'd rented for those 7 weeks. He went home and he practiced a little bit, but then he thought, I got this. You know, this is easy. This is a waste of my time. So he just goofed off and kind of watched TV and found other things to occupy his time while he was there. He goes back for the next lesson, and Galamian says, play first scale. So Aldi plays the scale, and Galamian says, wrong. Read instructions again. He got something wrong. So he says, play next scale. So Aldi starts playing that scale. Stop. He went through about 3 scales, and Galamian just says, how much time you practice? He says, oh, maybe an hour or 2. And Galamian said, you practice 4 hours a day, every day. He says, lesson is over. You come back when you practice like I tell you. He kicked him out. And Aldi was devastated. I mean, he got like 15 minutes into his 1-hour lesson, and the lesson was over. Galamian was mad at him. The legendary Ivan Galamian was mad at him and kicked him out. So he thought, man, I'm going to blow this. My parents are going to be so mad at me if I blow this. So he says, I've got to buckle down and get this right. So he went back and he started practicing those scales like his life depended on it. Did everything Galamian said. He thought Galamian's method was stupid. He didn't like Galamian's personality, but he was afraid to face his parents if he blew this opportunity. So he went ahead and he got with the program. Goes back for his next lesson, and Galamian says, do you practice? He says, yes. He says, play first scale. So he starts on the scale, and he plays it all the way through. Galamian didn't stop him. And then Galamian says, play next scale. So he played that one. Took him through all 10 scales. Galamian never stopped him. He got done with the 10th scale, and Galamian says, okay, we move on. That's about as close as you'll get to Galamian saying good job. He didn't give you a pat on the back or anything, but if he didn't yell at you, you knew you did good. And so the rest of the 7 weeks went like that. It was just more scales, more scales, more scales, different bowing patterns, different ways of doing the exercises and so forth. And of course, Aldi thought the whole thing was a waste of time, but he did what Galamian told him to do. So he gets back to Tulsa after the 7 weeks, and he said, and this is Aldi telling me the story, he said, my violin playing was on a new level entirely. Everything was so much easier. And he said it was like my bow, like I was one with my bow. It was just an extension of my arm. And it was just gliding across the strings. He said it was unbelievable, the difference in my playing after I did what Galamian told me to do. And Aldi was telling me this because he wanted me to understand the importance of bowing exercises. Because I was wanting to learn songs. I was wanting to, learn how to play with vibrato and how to play fast and everything. And he said, no, Rod, it's all about the bow. You've got to learn how to master the bow, or you're never going to get the right tone. You're not going to be able to play the violin the way that you want to play it if you don't do the bowing exercises and learn bowing technique. Now, the moral of this story is that sometimes we just get complacent with where we're at, not only as musicians, but as people, as Christians. You can get complacent where you're at. You can get kind of cocky. The Apostle Paul said, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God. And he went on to say, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think, but think soberly. So don't get cocky and complacent with where you're at. Always understand that there's more to learn and that there's room for improvement. Because if you get complacent and if you get cocky, you're going to encounter a huge disappointment. You're setting yourself up for a fall. We always have to be pressing on and improving and striving for better and better and better, not just as musicians, but as Christians as well. So Aldi went on to become the principal violinist with the Tulsa Philharmonic, in part because Ivan Galamian kicked him in the pants and got him to go and take his violin playing to that next level. And now he's since moved on. He left Tulsa and he took a job in another state. And so I only got to spend 1 year with Aldi, but it was invaluable, the lessons that I learned from him, because he had that opportunity to study with the legendary Ivan Galamian, as very few people in the Tulsa area could say, that could make that claim that they studied with Galamian. So if you want to be good, listen to people who have been there who've learned some things, and do what they tell you to do. Take advantage of their knowledge and their wisdom that they've gained through the years. Whether you like their personality and their style or not, whether you agree with their system or not, there's so much you can learn from people who have years of experience that they can just hand to you on a silver platter and say, learn from my experience. So I hope that helps you in your Christian walk as well as your musical endeavors. It certainly helped me, because Aldi told me this because I didn't like doing those exercises that he had me do, and he knew I wasn't enjoying them. But he said, there's a reason you're doing this, Rod. There's a reason. You do what I tell you to do, and in a couple of years, you'll be a violinist. And I only got to spend 1 year with him, but my playing improved tremendously because Aldi pushed me and he made me do those exercises that I didn't want to do. So that's it. We'll see you next week in the next Musical Monday. God bless.